Death at the Wine Tasting Evening. Good evening, dear listeners. I'm Stephen, and welcome to Cozy Mysteries, where we unravel the most perplexing puzzles from the annals of crime. Tonight, I invite you to join me as I recount a most extraordinary case, one that unfolded on a crisp October evening at Heatherton Manor, where sophistication and murder became unexpectedly intertwined. Chapter 1. An Evening of Vintage Distinction. The Heatherton Wine Society was renowned throughout the county for its exclusive membership and impeccable taste. On this particular Saturday, the society had organised something truly special, a vertical tasting of Chateau Margaux spanning 60 years of vintages from 1945 to 2005. For those unfamiliar with such refined pursuits, a vertical tasting allows connoisseurs to compare the same wine across different years, appreciating how time and terroir influence the final product. 12 distinguished members gathered in the Manor's oak-panelled tasting room, their anticipation palpable. Among them sat a gentleman whose presence might have seemed incongruous to those unfamiliar with his reputation, a small, fastidious Belgian with an egg-shaped head and remarkably green eyes. He had been invited by his friend, wine collector Sir Reginald Montford, who knew the Belgian gentleman's appreciation extended beyond mere drinking, to the science and history of viticulture itself. The evening progressed with civilized elegance. Each vintage was introduced with scholarly precision by the Society's president, Mr. Charles Weatherby, a distinguished man in his late 50s with silver hair and the confident bearing of inherited wealth. He described each wine's characteristics, the weather conditions of its vintage year, and its current market value with equal enthusiasm. As the clock approached 9:30, an almost reverential hush fell over the room. They were about to taste the 1961 vintage, widely considered one of the finest wines of the 20th century. A single bottle could command £15,000 at auction, and tonight's bottle had been generously donated by Weatherby himself, recently inherited from his late uncle's legendary cellar. Weatherby performed the decanting ceremony with practiced grace, using an heirloom silver funnel to separate the precious liquid from decades of accumulated sediment. The wine flowed like liquid garnet into the crystal decanter, and then Weatherby carefully poured 12 glasses, setting the first aside for himself as tradition dictated. At precisely 9:45, as the assembled connoisseurs raised their glasses to appreciate the wine's legendary bouquet, Charles Weatherby lifted his own glass to his lips. He managed one sip before his expression transformed from pleasure to confusion, then to unmistakable agony. The glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the Persian carpet, as Weatherby clutched at his throat and collapsed. The small Belgian gentleman was beside him in an instant, but years of experience told him immediately what the rigid muscles and dilated pupils confirmed. This was no mere heart attack or stroke. As Weatherby's breathing grew laboured and his lips turned blue, the detective's acute senses detected a faint, acrid scent mingling with the wine's complex perfume. By the time the physician arrived 10 minutes later, Charles Weatherby was dead, and the Belgian gentleman, whose name was Hercule Poirot, had already begun arranging his little grey cells to address a most fascinating paradox. How could one man die from poisoned wine when all 12 guests had drunk from the same bottle? Chapter 2. The Paradox of the Poisoned Glass. The Manor's drawing room had been transformed into a temporary headquarters for the investigation. The local police inspector, a competent man named Graves, had the good sense to recognise expertise when he saw it, and readily accepted Poirot's assistance. "The situation is impossible," Inspector Graves declared, consulting his notes. The wine was poured from a single bottle. All 12 attendees drank from that same bottle. Yet only Mr. Weatherby died. The physician confirms monkshood poisoning, aconitine to be precise, a most deadly substance. The small detective sat with his fingers pressed together, forming a perfect steeple. Ah, yes, the paradox presents itself most clearly. Either the poison entered only Mr. Weatherby's glass after the wine was poured, requiring someone to have access to his specific glass, or the bottle itself was contaminated in such a manner that only one glass would receive the fatal dose. Both scenarios present difficulties, none. He began his methodical examination of the facts. The bottle had arrived that very afternoon, brought by Weatherby himself from his private cellar. It had remained in the Manor's temperature-controlled wine room until 9:15, when Weatherby retrieved it for decanting. During those hours, only the Manor's butler and 2 society members, both of whom had drunk from the same bottle, had been near the wine room. The decanting had occurred in full view of all attendees. Weatherby had carefully removed the cork, examined it for soundness, then poured the wine through the silver funnel into the crystal decanter. The funnel, Poirot learned, was a Weatherby family heirloom, kept in a locked cabinet in the Manor's dining room. Charles had retrieved it himself that evening using his own key. "Tell me," Poirot addressed the assembled witnesses, "this first glass that Monsieur Weatherby poured for himself, this is customary?" Sir Reginald Montfort nodded. "Standard practice for any serious sommelier. The first pour checks for cork taint or other flaws. Charles always tasted first when presenting a valuable wine." "But he did not drink immediately?" "No," confirmed another member, Mrs. Olivia Hartford. "Charles set his glass aside, saying the wine needed to breathe. He poured for all of us. First, explained the vintage's history, and only then did he return to his own glass. Perhaps 15 minutes elapsed." Poirot's green eyes gleamed with interest. 15 minutes, and during this time, where was Madame Weatherby? Eleanor Weatherby, a handsome woman in her early 50s with carefully styled auburn hair, had been sitting quietly in the corner, wrapped in a cashmere shawl. She looked up at the question, her face pale. "I was here, in the tasting room, the entire evening. I don't particularly care for wine tastings. Charles always said I lacked the palate for it, but I attended as hostess. I sat near the door, greeting members as they arrived." "And you did not partake of the 1961 vintage?" "I had a small taste, like everyone else, from the same bottle." Her voice trembled slightly. "My husband is dead, Monsieur Poirot. Surely you don't suspect me?" The detective's expression revealed nothing. "I suspect no one and everyone, madame. It is the only way to arrive at truth." He turned his attention to the physical evidence. The shattered wine glass had been carefully collected, its fragments showing clear traces of both wine and aconitine. The remaining wine in the decanter and the other 11 glasses contained no trace of poison whatsoever. The bottle itself, now empty, was similarly clean. "Consider the timing," Poirot murmured to Inspector Graves. "The poison acts quickly, within minutes, yet Monsieur Weatherby set his glass aside for a quarter of an hour. If someone added poison during that interval, they required access to his specific glass amid a room full of witnesses." "Perhaps someone switched glasses," Graves suggested. Non. Sir Reginald tells me that serious collectors can identify their glass by position and the wine's specific colour and viscosity. Any switching would have been immediately noticed by these experts. Besides, such a switch would require knowing in advance which glass Monsieur Weatherby would claim as his own. Poirot stood abruptly, his precision evident in every movement. "Inspector, I require your permission to examine 3 things: the wine cellar where the bottle was stored, the cabinet where the silver funnel is kept, and Madame Weatherby's personal effects. Also, I wish to speak with this uncle from whom Monsieur Weatherby inherited his wine collection. When did he die?" 3 months ago, Eleanor Weatherby answered quietly. "Uncle Mortimer was 92. He left Charles his entire cellar, nearly 500 bottles of extraordinary vintages." "And the value of this collection?" Mrs. Hartford interjected. "Over £500,000 easily. Mortimer Weatherby was legendary among collectors." Poirot's eyebrows rose fractionally. "Ah, how very interesting. And in the event of Monsieur Charles Weatherby's death, who inherits this valuable collection?" The silence that followed answered his question more eloquently than words. Chapter 3. The Secret of the Silver Funnel. The next morning found our detective in the Manor's wine cellar, a magnificently appointed underground chamber where temperature and humidity were controlled with scientific precision. Row upon row of bottles rested in specially designed racks, their labels facing outward for easy identification. The cellar master, an elderly gentleman named Peters, who had served the manor for 40 years, explained the security measures. "Every bottle is logged in this registry, sir. When Mr. Weatherby retrieved the 61 Margot yesterday afternoon, I recorded the removal myself. He signed for it here, you see." Poirot examined the ledger with his characteristic thoroughness. The entry was clear. October 14th, 4:30 p.m., 1 bottle Chateau Margaux 1961, removed by C. Weatherby for society tasting. But something else caught his attention. Several other entries in recent weeks, all in Charles Weatherby's hand, noting examinations of various bottles from his inherited collection. "He was cataloguing Uncle Mortimer's wines," Peters explained. "Mr. Weatherby wanted to create a complete inventory. He'd spend hours down here checking conditions, making notes. Very particular he was." "And Madame Weatherby? Did she visit the cellar?" "Never, sir. Said the temperature gave her chills, though she did have all the family silver cleaned and restored about 6 weeks ago, including that decanting funnel Mr. Weatherby used. Had it sent to some fancy London silversmith." This information proved most illuminating. Poirot requested the silversmith's details and made a telephone call from the Manor's study. The conversation was brief but revealing. "Yes, we did clean the Weatherby silver," confirmed the silversmith, a Mr. Ashford of Knightsbridge. "Beautiful pieces, 18th century most of them. The decanting funnel required only standard cleaning, removing tarnish, polishing. We did no modifications whatsoever, despite what the invoice might suggest." "The invoice suggests modifications?" "Indeed. Mrs. Weatherby added charges for custom restoration work when she collected the pieces, said it was for insurance purposes. I found it odd, but assumed she had her reasons. The total came to an extra £200 beyond our actual charges." Poirot thanked him and rang off, his fingers drumming thoughtfully on the desk. He then requested that Inspector Graves retrieve the Weatherby family's banking records and the silversmith's invoice. While waiting, he turned his attention to the funnel itself. The piece was exquisite, Georgian silver with a fine mesh screen designed to catch sediment while allowing aged wine to flow freely. Poirot borrowed a jeweller's loupe from the Manor's collection and examined every millimetre of the funnel's surface with painstaking care. And there, welded so skillfully that it appeared to be part of the original design, was a small chamber built into the funnel's stem. The chamber was perhaps 2 centimetres long and half a centimetre wide, tiny but sufficient to hold several drops of concentrated liquid. More remarkably, the chamber had a release valve so cunningly designed that it would open only when liquid flowed through the funnel at a specific rate and angle. "Regard, Inspector," Poirot said softly, demonstrating the mechanism. "When wine pours through at the proper speed, as it would during careful decanting of a valuable vintage, the valve opens automatically. The chamber empties its contents into the stream of wine. But observe what happens after the chamber empties." He poured water through the funnel to demonstrate. The first stream contained a drop of coloured liquid he'd added to the chamber. The second stream was clear. "The mechanism is designed to release only during the first pour," Poirot explained. "After that, the chamber is empty, and subsequent wine passes through cleanly. Ingenious, non?" The murderer understood that Monsieur Weatherby would pour himself the first glass, as tradition demanded. That glass, and only that glass, would contain the poison. Inspector Graves stared at the funnel in astonishment. But who could have had it modified? Who even knew such a mechanism was possible? "Ah, that is indeed the question. But first I wish to examine Madame Weatherby's garden. Peters mentioned she is an enthusiastic gardener, particularly of old English medicinal plants." They found Eleanor Weatherby in her greenhouse, tending to various herbs and flowers. She looked up as they entered, her expression wary. "Madame," Poirot began gently, "you have here a most impressive collection of plants. You are knowledgeable about their properties, yes?" "I've studied herbal medicine for years," she admitted. "It's a hobby of mine." "And this plant here?" He indicated a tall specimen with distinctive hooded flowers. "This is Aconitum napellus, is it not? Commonly called monkshood or wolfsbane." Eleanor's face drained of colour. "Many people grow monkshood. It's a common garden plant." "Indeed, but your gardening diary, which Inspector Graves has obtained with a warrant, indicates you have been harvesting this plant extensively over the past month. You noted you were preparing winter plant protection compounds. Tell me, madame, what precisely were you protecting?" The silence stretched between them, like a physical thing, heavy with unspoken truths and gathering consequences. Chapter 4. The Matter of Motive. Eleanor Weatherby's composure cracked like fine porcelain struck by a hammer. She sank onto a garden bench, her hands trembling as they gripped her skirt. "You must understand," she whispered. "Charles wasn't the man I married. Something changed in him after Uncle Mortimer died. The inheritance consumed him. All he could talk about was the wine collection, its value, how it would secure our future." Poirot settled onto the bench beside her, his voice unexpectedly gentle. "But the collection did not secure your future, did it?" "Madame?" She shook her head, tears beginning to flow. "3 weeks ago, I discovered he was having an affair. A woman 20 years younger, Sophie Marsh, an art gallery owner in London. He'd been spending our money on her, buying her gifts, financing her lifestyle. When I confronted him, he said he wanted a divorce." "And the prenuptial agreement?" Poirot already knew the answer, having reviewed the Weatherbys' legal documents that morning. "I would receive almost nothing. The agreement was signed 25 years ago when Charles's father insisted on it. I was young and in love and foolish. I signed away any claim to family assets, including inheritances received during the marriage. Uncle Mortimer's collection would remain entirely Charles's property, or rather Sophie's, once he married her." Inspector Graves frowned. "But surely, as a widow, you would inherit." "Everything," Eleanor confirmed bitterly. "The house, the collection, all our joint assets. The prenuptial agreement only governed divorce settlements, not inheritance. Charles knew this. He told me himself, laughing, that I'd chosen the wrong solution, that I should pray for his death rather than agree to the divorce." Poirot's green eyes studied her with uncomfortable intensity. "And so you took his suggestion, madam. You arranged for his death most cleverly, using your knowledge of his wine expertise as the weapon, the monkshood from your garden, the modified funnel, the valuable vintage that you knew he would decant himself, all planned with mathematical precision." I couldn't." But her protests died under his steady gaze. "The silversmith in London did not perform the modifications you claimed on the invoice," Poirot continued. "You used his legitimate cleaning service as a cover, but you had the actual modification done elsewhere, perhaps a metal worker who asked no questions if paid sufficiently. You practiced the technique at home, yes? My examination of your kitchen drain this morning revealed traces of both wine and aconitine. You tested the mechanism to ensure it would work exactly as planned." Eleanor's face had gone completely white. "How could you possibly know?" "The little grey cells, madame. They observe, they deduce, they reconstruct. You prepared the monkshood tincture yourself. Your greenhouse contains all the necessary equipment for extracting concentrated alkaloids from plant materials. You filled the funnel's hidden chamber before the tasting, knowing that Charles would retrieve it himself from the locked cabinet. The poison would be released only into the first glass, the one he would pour for himself." Inspector Graves pulled out his notebook, but Poirot held up a hand. "Un moment, Inspector. There is more to understand before we proceed. Madame Weatherby, you made one critical error in your planning. You assumed your husband would drink from his first glass immediately, as sommeliers typically do, but he did not. He set it aside," Eleanor whispered, fresh tears streaming down her face. "For 15 minutes that glass sat there, and I knew the poison was in it, waiting. I thought I would go mad. I kept checking my watch, asking if he was going to taste it. I couldn't help myself." "And therein lies your confession," Poirot said softly. "Multiple witnesses observed your unusual anxiety during those 15 minutes. They saw you watching the glass, checking the time, your distress growing with each passing moment. An innocent person would have shown no such concern, but you knew what was in that glass, and you could not conceal your guilty knowledge." Eleanor buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. "He destroyed everything. Our marriage, my trust, my financial security, all of it. I built my business before we married, earned everything I had, and he was stealing it to support his mistress. The prenuptial agreement was coerced. His father threatened to disinherit him if we married without it. Was I supposed to simply accept losing everything while he rode off into the sunset, with a younger woman and my money?" "There were legal remedies," Inspector Graves said stiffly. Courts can invalidate coerced prenuptial agreements. Can they? Eleanor's laugh was bitter. Perhaps, after years of expensive litigation that I couldn't afford because Charles controlled all our liquid assets, perhaps, if I could prove coercion from a dead man who left no evidence of his threats, perhaps, if judges decided that a young woman's choice to marry despite an unfair contract wasn't her own foolish fault. Poirot stood, brushing invisible dust from his immaculate trousers. Inspector, I must ask you to give me a few hours before making an arrest. There are still details to confirm, evidence to gather. Madame Weatherby will not flee. She has nowhere to go, n'est-ce pas? Eleanor looked up at him with hollow eyes. Where would I run? And what would be the point? You've already unravelled everything. Not everything, madame. Not yet. Chapter 5. The Evidence of Receipts. Back in the Manor's study, Poirot spread documents across the mahogany desk like a scholar examining ancient manuscripts. Inspector Graves watched with undisguised curiosity as the little detective arranged bank statements, receipts, and correspondence in precise columns. "You are troubled, my friend," Graves observed. "Mrs. Weatherby has essentially confessed. The evidence is clear: the modified funnel, the Monkshood harvest, her suspicious behaviour during the critical 15 minutes. Why delay the arrest?" "Because, Inspector, I have learned through long experience that clear evidence and complete truth are not always the same thing. There are layers to this case that we have not yet excavated. Observe these bank records." He indicated a series of highlighted transactions. Over the past 18 months, Charles Weatherby withdrew substantial sums from the couple's joint account, £50,000 in total. The stated purpose was investment in his wine collection, yes? But look more closely at the timing. Graves peered at the dates. The withdrawals began about a year ago and increased in frequency and amount over recent months. Précisément. And now observe these. Poirot produced a stack of receipts recovered from Charles Weatherby's London office. Jewellery purchases from Cartier, weekend stays at the Savoy Hotel, payments to a Mayfair apartment rental agency, all dating from the same period as the withdrawals. For his mistress, obviously. Yes, but consider the amounts, Inspector. £20,000 for a diamond bracelet, £15,000 for a month at a luxury hotel suite, £8,000 for furnishing an apartment. These are not the gifts of a discreet affair. They are the expenditures of a man flaunting his wealth, making a public display of his new relationship. Poirot's fingers drummed on the desk. More interesting still, examine the dates carefully. The most extravagant purchases, those totalling nearly £30,000, were made in the 3 weeks after Uncle Mortimer's will was read. Charles Weatherby came into his inheritance and immediately began spending as if the money were already his. Which it was, legally. But wine collections are not liquid assets, mon ami. Those bottles cannot be easily converted to cash without time and proper market conditions. Yet Charles was spending money he did not actually have in hand. He was anticipating the collection's value as if it were already realized. Inspector Graves frowned. "Are you suggesting financial motive beyond the inheritance itself?" "I am suggesting we examine more deeply. I have made inquiries with several wine auction houses. Charles Weatherby had been in contact with 3 different establishments about selling portions of his inherited collection. He was actively planning to liquidate these assets, bottles that enthusiasts had spent lifetimes acquiring, reduced to mere cash to fund his new life. Poirot produced another document. And here we find something most illuminating. A letter from Charles's solicitor, dated 2 weeks before his death, outlining the divorce settlement he proposed. Eleanor would receive the house, but nothing else. No share of investments, no portion of the wine collection, no ongoing support. After 25 years of marriage, she would be left with property and little else. The prenuptial agreement allowed this? Technically, yes. But observe the solicitor's notation here in the margin. Client insists on minimum settlement, despite my recommendation for more generous terms. Advised that contested divorce could prove expensive and time-consuming. Even Charles's own lawyer thought the settlement unreasonable. Graves studied the letters with growing unease. So we have a husband systematically dismantling the marital estate, flaunting an affair with expensive gifts, and preparing to leave his wife, virtually penniless after a quarter-century marriage. It's cruel, certainly, but it doesn't change the fact that she murdered him. Non, Inspector, it does not change the fact of murder, but it does change how we understand the crime, yes? This was not a woman who killed for greed or impatience. This was a woman who watched her financial security being stolen piece by piece, who saw her life's work, her own business earnings that had gone into their joint accounts, being spent on another woman who faced losing everything while the man responsible suffered no consequences whatsoever. Poirot's voice had taken on an unusual edge of emotion. The law, Inspector Graves, is supposed to provide justice, but what justice was available to Eleanor Weatherby? Years of expensive litigation she could not afford. Perhaps a judgment invalidating the prenuptial agreement? Perhaps not. And meanwhile, Charles would have sold the wine collection, spent the money, and left her with legal bills and an empty victory. You're not suggesting her actions were justified. I suggest nothing of the sort. Murder can never be justified, no matter how inadequate the legal remedies might be. But I am suggesting that we must understand the complete picture before we judge. There is still one piece of this puzzle that troubles me deeply. He stood and began pacing, his hands clasped behind his back. The timing, mon ami. Why did Eleanor choose this moment, this method? The expensive 1961 Margot, the public setting, the elaborate mechanism in the funnel. All of it seems almost designed to be discovered eventually. A clever woman who had planned murder with such precision would surely have chosen a less theatrical method. Non? Perhaps she wanted to make a statement. Perhaps. Or perhaps, Poirot paused mid-stride, his green eyes suddenly bright with realization. Or perhaps there is something we have not yet discovered. Inspector, I must examine Charles Weatherby's correspondence once more. There is a letter I wish to find, a letter that will, I think, make everything clear. Chapter 6. The Letter That Changed Everything. The late afternoon sun slanted through the study windows as Poirot methodically reviewed Charles Weatherby's personal papers. Inspector Graves had dozed off in an armchair, worn out by the day's investigations, when suddenly Poirot's exclamation startled him awake. Voila! Here it is, the piece that completes the puzzle. The letter was dated 1 week before Charles Weatherby's death. It came from a law firm in London, not his regular solicitor, but a different practice specializing in prenuptial agreement disputes. The content was brief but devastating. Dear Mr. Weatherby, following our consultation of October 7th, I must advise that your wife has excellent grounds for challenging the prenuptial agreement executed in 1998. The circumstances you described, particularly your father's threats, regarding inheritance and your wife's youth and lack of legal counsel at signing, constitute clear evidence of duress. Furthermore, your wife's business income during the marriage, which she contributed to joint accounts and which you subsequently controlled, strengthens her claim to equitable distribution of marital assets. In similar cases, courts have awarded 40 to 60% of total marital wealth, regardless of prenuptial restrictions. I recommend immediate settlement negotiations. A contested divorce proceeding would be expensive and lengthy, and your current disposal of marital assets, the recent purchases you mentioned, could be viewed as dissipation, potentially increasing her awarded portion. The wine collection you inherited during marriage may be particularly vulnerable to division claims, as its maintenance and storage involve joint marital funds. Poirot looked up from the letter, his expression grave. Do you understand what this means, Inspector? Charles Weatherby had been advised that Eleanor could successfully challenge the prenuptial agreement. The wine collection, worth over £500,000, might have to be divided. His plans to divorce cheaply and keep everything were about to be thwarted. So, he might have sought other solutions, Graves said slowly. Précisément. But I do not think Charles planned murder, Inspector. His character, as reported by all who knew him, was selfish and cruel. Yes, but not violent. He was a man who solved problems with money and lawyers, not poison. Non, I think something else occurred. Poirot began pacing again, his words coming faster as the pieces assembled in his mind. Consider the choreography of that evening once more. Charles brought the valuable bottle from his cellar. Charles retrieved the funnel from the locked cabinet, using his own key, Inspector, not Eleanor's. Charles performed the decanting in front of witnesses, and Charles poured his own glass first, as tradition demanded. But the funnel had been modified. Yes, and when? Eleanor claimed she had the silver cleaned 6 weeks ago, but suppose the modification was done more recently? Suppose it was done not by Eleanor at all, but by Charles himself? Inspector Graves sat up straight. You think Weatherby modified his own funnel? Consider the evidence. The silversmith said Eleanor added charges for restoration work that was never performed. But what if those charges were not for restoration but for payment to someone else? Someone Charles hired to do the actual modification? Eleanor handled the invoice, but Charles could easily have arranged the metalwork separately. Poirot produced another document from Charles's desk, a receipt from a metalworker in Southwark, dated 5 weeks prior, for custom fabrication work on antique silver piece. The amount matched exactly the restoration charges Eleanor had added to the silversmith's invoice. Charles had the funnel modified, Poirot continued, but not to kill himself. None. He intended to use it to kill Eleanor. That is why he documented her extensive monkshood cultivation in his diary. Notes I found this morning, carefully recording dates and quantities. He was building evidence that she had access to poison. The inspector's face had gone pale. But then what happened? Why did he die instead? Because Eleanor discovered his plan, Inspector. That is the tragedy here. 2 people, each planning to murder the other. Charles intended to poison his wife and frame it as suicide, using her own garden plants as evidence. But Eleanor found out. Perhaps she discovered the modified funnel during her regular household management. Perhaps she read his diary. Perhaps she simply knew her husband well enough to suspect his intentions. Poirot's voice grew heavy with sadness. And so she turned his weapon against him. She removed the poison he had prepared, traces of which I found in his study desk, hidden in a locked drawer, and she replaced it with her own preparation. Charles planned to poison Eleanor's glass that evening using the funnel's mechanism. Instead, the mechanism he himself had designed delivered death to him. My God, Graves whispered. It was self-defense in a way. Was it? That is the question we must answer, mon ami. If Eleanor killed to prevent her own murder, is it still murder? If she used Charles's own weapon and plan against him, does that change the moral calculus? These are questions that go beyond the mere mechanics of crime and into the realm of justice itself. Poirot sat down heavily, suddenly looking older than his years. The law is clear. She committed murder with premeditation. But the law is also clear that Charles attempted murder first. 2 people, trapped in a marriage that had become a war, each chose violence over the legal remedies available to them. And now one is dead, and the other must face the consequences of a crime that was also self-preservation. Inspector Graves stood, straightening his uniform. I'll need to arrest her, Poirot. Whatever the circumstances, she did kill him. I understand, Inspector, but first there is someone else we must speak with, the woman who precipitated this entire tragedy. I think it is time we visited Miss Sophie Marsh. Chapter 7. The Catalyst of Betrayal. Sophie Marsh's art gallery occupied a prime corner location in Mayfair, its windows displaying contemporary pieces that spoke of expensive taste and exclusive clientele. The woman herself proved to be exactly as Eleanor had described, 20 years younger than Charles Weatherby, attractive in a studied way, with carefully highlighted hair and designer clothing that whispered rather than shouted its expense. She received Poirot and Inspector Graves in her office, a minimalist space decorated with abstract paintings and uncomfortable-looking modern furniture. Her confidence faltered only slightly when Graves introduced himself as a police officer. I heard about Charles, she said, her voice carrying traces of both grief and defensiveness. It's terrible. I don't understand why you're here. We were friends, nothing more. Poirot's eyebrows rose fractionally. Friends, mademoiselle? But I have here receipts showing Monsieur Weatherby spent over £50,000 on you in the past year. That is considerable friendship, non? Her composure cracked. Charles was generous. He liked to give gifts. What's wrong with that? Nothing, except that the gifts were given with money that belonged jointly to him and his wife. Money that Madame Weatherby earned through her own business before marriage, placed into joint accounts in good faith. Money that Monsieur Weatherby systematically stole to finance his new relationship. He didn't steal anything, Sophie's voice rose. Eleanor gave up her business when they married. Charles supported her for 25 years. He had every right to spend his own money as he chose. Poirot leaned forward, his green eyes sharp. Ah, but that is precisely the question, is it not? Whose money was it? The courts might have had interesting opinions on that matter had the divorce proceeded. Did you know that Charles's own lawyer advised him that Eleanor could successfully challenge the prenuptial agreement? Sophie's face had gone pale. Charles told me there was a prenup. He said Eleanor would get nothing, that we could be married within a year once the divorce was final. And you believed him? Why wouldn't I? But her voice wavered. Charles said his uncle's wine collection would make us financially secure. He was already contacting auction houses about selling it. He showed me the estimates, over £500,000. Poirot produced the letter from Charles's lawyers. Did he show you this letter, mademoiselle, advising him that the wine collection might have to be divided with Eleanor? Did he mention that his plans to divorce cheaply and keep everything were about to collapse? No, Sophie whispered. He never said anything about that. Because he knew you would not be so enthusiastic about a relationship that came with expensive legal battles and reduced assets, no? Charles Weatherby was a man who lied to everyone, to his wife about his fidelity, to you about his divorce prospects, to the wine society about his financial stability. The question I must ask you, mademoiselle, is this. What did you know of his plans? Plans? What plans? I don't understand what you're implying. Inspector Graves cleared his throat. Miss Marsh, we have evidence that Charles Weatherby modified an antique silver funnel with a mechanism designed to deliver poison to a specific glass of wine. We believe he intended to murder his wife and frame it as suicide. Sophie's shock appeared genuine. She stood abruptly, backing away from them. No, that's insane. Charles wouldn't. He couldn't. And yet he did, Poirot said quietly. The evidence is indisputable. But Eleanor discovered his plan and turned it against him. She killed him, yes, but she killed a man who was preparing to kill her. The question before us now is whether you were part of his scheme. I knew nothing about any murder plot, Sophie's voice shook. Charles told me Eleanor was unstable, that she had threatened him, that he was afraid of her. He said she'd become obsessed with plants and herbs, that she'd been harvesting poisonous things from her garden. He made her sound dangerous. Poirot exchanged a meaningful glance with Inspector Graves. Ah, and when did he begin saying these things? About 6 weeks ago. He said he was documenting her behaviour, keeping notes in case she did something violent. He was worried she might hurt him or herself. Building his case, Poirot murmured, creating a narrative where Eleanor was the dangerous, unstable wife who might resort to poison. When she was found dead, all evidence would point to suicide, a troubled woman who took her own life. And you, mademoiselle, would have been his witness, able to testify that he had expressed fears about her mental state. Chapter 8. The Web of Deception. Sophie Marsh collapsed into her chair, her carefully maintained composure completely shattered. He was using me, she whispered. All this time, I believed he loved me, but I was just part of his plan, wasn't I? Poirot's expression softened slightly. Love and manipulation are not always mutually exclusive, mademoiselle. Perhaps Charles Weatherby convinced himself he cared for you, even as he used you. But I genuinely didn't know about any murder plot. You have to believe me. I am inclined to believe you, Poirot acknowledged. You were what the Americans call the useful fool, someone who served Charles's purpose without understanding the full picture. He fed you information carefully designed to paint Eleanor as unstable. Inspector Graves made notes. Miss Marsh, we'll need a full statement about everything Charles Weatherby told you regarding his wife. As Sophie recounted the elaborate lies Charles had woven, Poirot constructed a psychological profile of the dead man. Charles had been intelligent, methodical, and utterly without conscience, a man who viewed other people as obstacles to be removed or tools to be used. Did Monsieur Weatherby ever discuss his financial situation with complete honesty? Poirot interrupted. She shook her head. Charles always said money was no object. He talked about the collection as if it were unlimited wealth. Ah, but it was not, Poirot said. Monsieur Weatherby owed over £80,000 to various creditors. The wine collection was his only means of avoiding financial ruin, and Eleanor's potential claim to half of it represented catastrophe. He stood and began pacing. You see now the desperation that drove him? Charles Weatherby was a man with his back against the wall. Murder became, in his twisted logic, the only economically viable solution. "That's monstrous," Sophie breathed. "Oui, monstrous indeed. But Eleanor was equally desperate, no? She faced losing everything while the man who had stolen from her faced no consequences. She chose murder instead of lawyers, just as Charles did." After Sophie departed with a constable, Graves turned to Poirot. "This changes everything. Eleanor killed a man who was actively planning to kill her. Is it self-defense when you discover someone planning to attack you next week and you strike first?" Poirot's voice was troubled. "That is the question that haunts me." Chapter 9. The Moment of Discovery. Eleanor Weatherby moved to a writing desk and retrieved a leather-bound diary. Her hands trembled as she opened it. 3 weeks ago," she said quietly, "I found Charles's journal hidden in his study. It detailed his research into poisons, specifically aconitine extracted from monkshood. He'd recorded the lethal dosage, the symptoms, the time to death." She handed the journal to Poirot. The entries were meticulous, chronicling not just poison research, but a psychological profile of Eleanor herself, her routines, her habits, her known love of herbal gardening. "He documented my monkshood cultivation," Eleanor continued. "He was building a case that I had access to poison. When I died, all evidence would point to suicide." "But you did not go to the police," Inspector Graves observed. "Who would have believed me? Charles was respected, beloved. I was the quiet, mousy wife. If I'd accused him of planning murder, he would have said I was mad, exactly the narrative he was already constructing." "So you turned his plan against him," Poirot said softly. "Yes. I found the modified funnel in his workshop with a vial of aconitine beside it. I understood immediately what he intended. The first glass would go to him for tasting, the second to me. The mechanism would release poison into my glass." "And you switched the poison?" "I replaced his aconitine with my own preparation. The morning of the event, while he was in the cellar, I made the substitution. He poured himself death thinking he was pouring mine." Poirot was silent. "You understand this confession makes your situation more grave. You have admitted to premeditated murder. The fact that Monsieur Weatherby planned to kill you first may evoke sympathy, but it does not constitute a legal defense." "I know," Eleanor's composure cracked. "But what was I supposed to do? Wait for him to poison me? Trust that the police would believe me over a charming wine collector?" She turned to Poirot, her voice breaking. "Tell me, was I supposed to simply accept my death? Was I supposed to trust in a justice system that had already failed me?" Poirot's face showed profound emotion. "Madame, I cannot tell you what you should have done. I can only tell you what you did and what the consequences must be." Chapter 10. The Scales of Justice. The trial of Eleanor Weatherby began 6 weeks later at the Old Bailey, our detective observed from the gallery, his presence unobtrusive, but his attention absolute. The prosecution presented their case. Eleanor had committed premeditated murder. The modified funnel, the substituted poison, the careful timing, all demonstrated calculated intent. Self-defense required immediate threat. Eleanor had had time to seek legal protection. The defense countered with anticipatory self-defense, the right to protect oneself from an imminent threat. They presented Charles's journal, the funnel he had commissioned, the poison he had prepared. Eleanor had faced a credible threat to her life, with no reason to believe authorities would protect her. Eleanor herself testified steadily. "I understand what I did was wrong, but I also know that if I had done nothing, I would be dead. I chose life over law, and I will live with that choice every day." After 3 weeks, the jury returned their verdict. Guilty of manslaughter rather than murder. Eleanor Weatherby was sentenced to 8 years in prison. On the courthouse steps, Poirot stood with Inspector Graves, watching Eleanor being led away. "It's not justice," Graves said quietly. "She saved her own life and gets 8 years. He planned to murder her and gets to be remembered as a respected collector." Poirot was silent before responding. Justice is perhaps not the neat equation we wish it to be. Eleanor Weatherby is both victim and murderer. The law can only address the facts, the poison, the death, the premeditation. It cannot weigh souls. Then what's the point if the law can't deliver justice? Because it is all we have, Poirot replied. Imperfect though it may be, the law is society's attempt to create order from chaos. Yet I cannot condemn her, as I have condemned other murderers. She killed a man who was planning to kill her. As Stephen, I must conclude this tale. Eleanor served 5 years before release, using the wine collection proceeds to establish a foundation supporting women in financially coercive marriages. She never fully recovered from the trauma, but lived, which was more than Charles had planned. Our detective returned to his usual cases, but those who knew him noted a change, a recognition that moral equations were more complex than even his remarkable mind had previously acknowledged. Sometimes the greatest mystery is not who committed the crime, but whether there was any choice at all. This is Stephen, signing off from Cozy Mysteries. Good evening.